We have made it to the 2026 MLB draft. Another opportunity for us to add some young talent into the farm system. Obviously, this has been a really successful season for us thus far. We've already got over 60 wins. We're the number 2 seed in the National League. And much of that has been because of the performance of some of our young players, including, obviously, our first-round pick from last year's draft, Tommy Rogers, who is the face of our team going forward. But he's not the only super talented prospect who we've drafted over the last couple of years. Obviously, in Season 1, we picked Kyler Rodriguez in the first round, and we've seen some good and some bad from him, but overall still very excited about his future. Even in the middle rounds, you can find talent. Scott Rios was a 4th-round pick. Rodney Bravo was picked in the 3rd. Warner Green was a 2nd-rounder. Guys like George Groninga, Fernando Molina, and others, all acquired through the draft. We've gone through the prospects in this class over the last couple of episodes, so in case you missed either of those, I recommend you check out the series playlist where you can find any episode of the series that you may need to catch up on if you would like further context on a lot of these prospects in this year's class. So let's get this show on the road. The Philadelphia Phillies won the lottery. They have the number 1 pick. We'll be selecting at number 16 in the first round and every round. Keep in mind, we also have a compensatory pick with the loss of Blake Snell in free agency to the Arizona Diamondbacks. So let's get this started with the first pick in the 2026 MLB Draft. The Philadelphia Phillies select Joe Murdoch out of the University of Maryland. While there were some higher projected players, I'm not surprised that this is the route that the Phillies went. Philadelphia is looking for more pieces that can help them compete next season, and that's exactly what Murdoch brings to the table. One of the most impressive power bats in the college ranks, really in the last 20 years. He hit 2 home runs in the deciding College World Series game, leading Maryland to the win, and he ended up winning the College World Series MVP. With the second pick, the Colorado Rockies select Lincoln Ragsdale, a right-handed starting pitching prospect. Definitely did not see this one coming. I'm surprised he went this high. Our scouts really are not high on him at all. I don't get what the Rockies are doing with all of these great position players on the board, specifically shortstop Aaron Eldridge. He ends up being the 3rd pick to the Miami Marlins, who are laughing all the way to the bank. Eldridge was not supposed to make it to 3, but it works out for Miami as they get a potential cornerstone for the future. What a selection by Miami. Milo Superior to the White Sox. I thought he was the best pitching prospect in this class. Good pick for Chicago. Christopher Hinson to the Athletics. Our scouts didn't really like him that much. And the same can be said for Emil Franco, the top projected player in this class, who goes number 6 to the Los Angeles Angels. Our scouts don't seem to love the upside that Franco brings to the table. Still a first-round prospect, but we think he might be a little bit more raw offensively than other teams think. Vince Vernon goes to the Nationals. I like that pick quite a bit. Ian Averill to the Royals. Did not think he was going to go in the top 10. I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but I'm surprised. Elmer Enriquez, the catching prospect, goes to the Pirates. Mark Newcomb to Toronto. That certainly feels early. Our scouts thought he was more the 2nd-round guy. Irwin Hood goes to the Baltimore Orioles at 11. Mackenzie Torres out of Oregon State goes to the Rays. He was a guy we liked quite a bit. Cliff Iden goes to Detroit. He's more of the power profile at 3rd base. That's why we didn't scout him, because we don't need players like him. And the same can be said for Juan Guzman, who goes to the Mets. David Aguirre, the final pick before us. Our scouts thought he was one of the 5 best prospects in this draft. Definitely was a guy we would have considered here at number 16. He goes to the Padres, though, who have done a really good job in this series of drafting. So that brings us on the clock here at number 16 overall, and we've got to ask ourselves, do we want to go for a pitcher, knowing that there's probably more pitching depth down the board, or do we want to look at a position player? And there's certainly reasons for either idea. I will say I think this pitching class is not as deep as some of the other ones, so picking a guy who we really like, such as Mark Ibar, may be worth it here in the first round. The top-ranked position players are also way down the board, and they've got question marks. Johnny Hackman is someone who could be a starter right away, but he's on the older side at 21, and his ceiling seems to be limited. There's also center fielder Steve Rodriguez, who I think would have been a top 10 pick had he passed his physical, but now that's a question. Failed the physical, so obviously health is a question mark with him. if we do want to go with one of the pitchers, I think there are a couple of options. Obviously, as I mentioned, Mark Ibar looks quite solid. Our scouts seem to think he's one of the 3 best prospects in the draft. There's Tim Cullen as well, who I think also could be a starter for us right away. And I think having a guy like Cullen who can enter the rotation, you could argue might be a little bit more valuable than adding someone like Johnny Hackman because of all the depth we have in the outfield. Certainly a tough choice between these 4, but I think I know who I want. With the 16th pick in the 2026 MLB Draft, the San Francisco Giants select Johnny Hackman from the University of Michigan. So I said that I feel like adding a pitcher might be more useful for us than adding another outfielder, and I feel like that's true. But I think the value here with Johnny Hackman is too much to pass up. This is a guy who can be a really productive piece in our lineup as soon as next season. He might not have to play minor league baseball. This is somebody who could enter right into the outfield, give us solid defense, and give us a really solid all-around bat. He's very well-rounded offensively. He hits for contact. He hits for power, especially against left-handed pitching, which is something that we need. I want to add more guys who mash lefties. He also has good plate skills for a 21-year-old. One of the best hitters in college last year, and I think it will carry over to the big league level. Hits for average, gets on base by drawing walks. The extra base power is there, and I think he's solid enough defensively. Not going to win a Gold Glove, but he's no slouch. He's better than a lot of the defensive options that we have currently, given our struggles defensively throughout the year. I'm really excited about adding Hackman, and I think picking a player like him who doesn't necessarily have a super high ceiling but can start right away really tells us where this team is. We are in our title window. We're looking to compete, and Johnny Hackman is a guy who can help us compete for a World Series once he's available next season. I'm really excited about adding him to the squad. So for the 3rd straight season, it's an outfielder in the 1st round with Kyler Rodriguez, Tommy Rogers, and now Johnny Hackman. Isley Chu is also kind of in the same boat as Hackman. He goes to the Cubs, but I think he's a little bit worse and he is a little bit lower of a ceiling, so that's why I ultimately opted for Hackman. There goes Steve Rodriguez. He ends up going to the Cincinnati Reds. So the medical did lead him to slipping, in my opinion. He ends up in the late 1st round. Jay Rubel's a guy who we like quite a bit, more so as a 2nd-round prospect, but he is now in our division going to the Los Angeles Dodgers. Mark Ibar off the board. He goes to Atlanta, so the Braves might have added a really good pitcher. And then Tim Cullen, who I was praying would fall to our 2nd-round pick, ultimately is off the board here late in the 1st round in Minnesota. Big fan of that pick for the Twins. Again, a guy who can compete right away as somebody who you hope is going to crack the rotation next season. That brings us into the competitive balance round. Going to see a lot of relievers going off the board here, and as you guys know, it's usually against my philosophy to draft relievers at all unless I feel like they can be a really good player. Obviously, we did that in Season 1 with Fernando Molina, and so far that appears to have worked out. But for the most part, it's not something I like to do. So the more relievers that go off the board, the better. The Rockies picked starting pitcher Larry Catamar, and then they had the 1st pick of the 2nd round in which they select Ken Davis. I kind of figured the Rockies would take some big swings, being that they're going to have more bonus money, and I guess they kind of did. I mean, these 2 picks are fine. They both add to the pitching arsenal, but I still can't get behind their selection in the 1st round. Let's move a little bit faster now to our selection at 52nd overall. There are a couple of guys I'm hoping fall. Blake McGinnis was the #1 player on our board. He goes to the Phillies a couple picks before us. That one hurts. I think he would have had a potential, and I think he would have been pretty polished. The other guy I really liked is Keo Burton, and he goes to Detroit. This is really unfortunate. All the pitchers I wanted ended up going off the board. That means we're going to have to pivot here with our 2nd round selection, with all of our targets being off the board. Over the past couple of seasons, we've got who we wanted in the 2nd round, but it doesn't look like that'll be the case this year. So what's the play here? There are some intriguing pitching options if we want to go that route. It might be a little bit early for a guy like Chip Gilmore, but our scouts really like him. Ralph McKinnon is another intriguing option. He is super polished. And then in terms of the position players, we didn't scout Brandon Wood, but I'm intrigued by the skill set. He's a guy who I might want to take a shot on. Jimmy Vincent, we didn't scout him. I wish we did, but he looks solid. There's a lot of depth at shortstop. It might be a little bit early for some of these guys, but I do like these prospects. Luis Velasquez, another guy who we didn't scout, but I'm really intrigued by him. And then center fielder Julio Vaccaro, I like quite a bit as well. With the 52nd pick of the 2026 MLB Draft, the San Francisco Giants select Luis Velasquez out of the University of Southern California. So this is a little bit of a flyer because we haven't scouted him at all, but being that he's a 23-year-old college senior, there's a lot of film on this guy already. This is somebody who crushes the ball against lefties. That's the number one thing I notice about him. I want to add somebody who can be a platoon player for us who crushes lefties, and that's exactly what Luis Velasquez can do in the outfield. I think he's a solid enough defender, probably more of a left fielder. He doesn't have elite range, which is fine because we've got guys like Tommy Rogers who do. What I'm excited about, though, is his ability at the plate. He hits for contact, he hits for okay power, and again, mashes left-handed pitching. He's 23 years old. He's pretty polished. This is another pick where we're drafting a guy who we hope can give us some major league reps, but maybe won't necessarily be an all-star. Jimmy Vincent was a player I held in a similar regard. He goes with the very next pick to the Boston Red Sox. Some other notable picks in the second round include the outfielder Julio Vaccaro. He was my backup option. He ends up going to the Mariners. We scouted him a lot more than we did Velasquez, but ultimately, after really looking at it, I think Velasquez just fits what we need more than Vaccaro. And that'll wrap up the second round. And keep in mind, we have another pick pretty soon in the compensatory round, again, thanks to the loss of Blake Snell. Most of the guys I was targeting in this range have not gone off the board yet. So far, so good. Hopefully they can last a few more picks. Manuel Samuel, the shortstop, was a guy who I did like. He ends up going to the Detroit Tigers. And then the Padres get Scotty Hiller. That brings us on the clock at 73. Both of the pitchers I mentioned are still available with Chip Gilmore and Ralph McKinnon, who are both very different players. McKinnon's a guy who's going to potentially give you an option as a starter or as a reliever right away, whereas Gilmore's an upside swing. Most of the position players are still on the board as well. That includes the catcher, Brandon Wood. Oscar Alonso in the outfield is a guy who we've done quite a bit of work on, but we've already drafted 2 outfielders. A lot of shortstops are still on the board. Rick Corson amongst the top of that list. You've also got Jesus Ortiz and Francesco Gutierrez as well. Quinn Monk is an outfielder who I like. Maybe it's a little early for him, but he is a prospect who does really intrigue me. So with the 73rd pick in the 2026 MLB Draft, the San Francisco Giants select Francesco Gutierrez, a shortstop prospect out of Louisiana State University. So once again, we're going for another college bat. Gutierrez is a switch hitter who gives a really interesting profile at short. He was not projected to go until closer to our 4th round selection, but I did not want to risk him falling. I think this is a really intriguing player who I really wanted to make sure we got our hands on, and we do here, picking him a lot earlier than he was projected. He's a really intriguing prospect defensively, mostly because of his arm. He might have the strongest arm of any position player in this entire draft class. If he can improve his glove, I think this is somebody who could be a perennial gold glove option at shortstop. Offensively, he doesn't really do anything super well, but he's a switch hitter with contact and power upside. So again, we're picking more of an older prospect here with Gutierrez. He's not as polished as the first 2 players we drafted, but if he can develop the offense, if he can be a little bit more consistent with his glove, I think he could be a stud. Oscar Alonso, I said, was one of the guys we were looking at. He ends up going with the very next pick, and that brings us now into the 3rd round. I'm curious to see how many of the other players we are interested to go off the board. There's Brandon Wood to the Washington Nationals. I don't think we're going to regret passing on some of these guys for Gutierrez, even though there was a pretty high chance he would make it to our selection here. I just didn't feel like it was worth the risk of having him go in this range because I really liked him. So we're now on the board at 90th overall. We've only drafted position players so far. Could that change here with one of the pitchers? There aren't a lot of highly projected position players left. Quinn Monk is an option. Jesus Ortiz is as well. With the 90th pick in the 2026 MLB Draft, the San Francisco Giants select Chip Gilmore, a right-handed pitcher from Australia. So here in the 3rd round, we finally draft a pitcher, and we finally draft somebody younger than 21 years old. Our philosophy of this draft is that age is just a number. So ultimately, Gilmore is the selection here, and our scouts love this kid. They think he's a top 10 prospect in this draft. They have him ranked higher than even Johnny Hackman, who we picked in the 1st round. So why is that? Gilmore stands at 6'5", 230, 5-pitch mix, tops out at 97, has nasty stuff, doesn't throw walks, doesn't allow too many hits. The strikeout rate is a little bit low, But that's not what we've prioritized in our pitching staff. We prioritize guys who don't throw walks and who don't allow hits. And that's exactly what Chip Gilmore brings to the table. I don't think he's going to have the upside that, say, Scott Rios does, but I think this could end up working out just as the Scott Rios pick did a couple seasons ago. So that brings us here towards the end of the third round now, and this is obviously where it gets a lot harder to find talent. Sure, we found Scott Rios in the fourth round a couple years ago, but it is not easy to find players down the board who end up being really good. So hopefully our scouts, just like the past couple of years, end up finding some gems. Ted Horner was a guy I liked. He is a reliever, but he was a player I had my eye on. He ends up going to the Colorado Rockies, and that brings us on the board here with the 120th pick of the day. Not a lot of pitchers left, only a couple left. Is that the route we go with here, or do we go back to a position player? With the 120th pick in the 2026 MLB Draft, the San Francisco Giants select Quinn Monk, an outfielder from the Dominican Republic. So the Giants are going to pick another position player, their third outfielder of this class, and it's Monk. 19 years old, hits lefty, throws lefty. I think he's a little bit raw offensively, but for a fourth rounder, I like his ceiling. Defensively, he's got some intriguing tools. I think he has a lot of upside in the outfield, but again, he just needs more polish. This isn't somebody who I expect to contribute early on, but I think he's got the tools to be pretty good. Decent power. He can hit to all fields. The plate skills are a work in progress. So this is really a matter of how good our development team is as we look to turn this raw outfielder into hopefully a productive player for us down the line. That's going to send us here towards the end of the fourth round. The guy I was targeting with my next pick was starting pitcher Christian Byers. He ends up going to Minnesota. So again, the Twins steal another starter I had my eye on. Really not many pitchers left, which is unfortunate because we've only drafted one. Wade Curtis, the outfielder, was another guy I kind of liked. He was a player who we didn't scout this year, but we had scouted in the past. He ends up going to Milwaukee. Now into the fifth round now. We'll see what the board ultimately shakes up to be. Not a lot of players who we've targeted are left for us to pick here. So again, we're really searching for scraps at this point, and we'll see ultimately if we can look to find a gem here in the fifth round with only a couple pitchers left and not a lot of high upside position players. I think especially this year, the depth in this class was shaky, and it was harder for us to find intriguing prospects. So what will be the route here for the Giants? Do they take the swing on upside or look for a guy who's a little bit more polished? With the 150th pick, the San Francisco Giants select Omar Jimenez, a pitching prospect from the Dominican Republic. So once again, we're going back to the Dominican with Omar Jimenez. This is another large man, 6'5". I think he's even bigger than Gilmore. I think he's more like 240. 5-pitch mix, tops out at 98, doesn't allow walks, but unlike Gilmore, he throws a lot of strikeouts. He needs to be more consistent otherwise, and I do think he has a pretty limited ceiling, but I think he's probably going to be better right off the bat as opposed to Chip Gilmore, so I think it's more likely he reaches the majors early on. I'm just not sure if he's ever going to be a high-end starter. So now we have only one more pick left to go in the sixth round. There are a couple position players who I'm intrigued with, but I don't think will fall to us. One of them was outfielder William Pringle. He ends up going to the Diamondbacks. He has a fun name. I wish he would have ended up being better because I definitely would have picked him, but unfortunately, it was not meant to be. Rounding out the fifth round now, Federico Sanchez was the other position player I was kind of looking at. He goes to the Cubs. But again, we've already drafted 3 outfielders, so I didn't really want to pick another one. And now on to the sixth and final round of the day. It's really hard to find talent here, but we did draft George Groniga in the 6th round last year. He ended up being an A potential outfielder. I don't think we're going to get the same luck this year, but you never know. Maybe we end up finding another gem. There are some guys who I'm pretty intrigued by late. Bartolo Ramos is an interesting one. He goes to the Tigers, though, so we won't get a chance to pick him. And that brings us on the board with the final pick of the day. We're looking for upside. There aren't a lot of guys who I think can contribute early on. Who's somebody who could be good for us in the future? With the 180th pick of the 2026 MLB Draft, the San Francisco Giants select Tom Simpson, a second baseman from Jamaica. Simpson is not a player who we scouted this year, but for a 6th round guy, he's still somebody who we're quite familiar with. That's because he was a very highly regarded prospect a couple years ago, back in season 1 coming out of high school. He was projected to be a top 50 pick, ended up going in the second round to the Minnesota Twins. He didn't sign with Minnesota, and that proved to be a big mistake because over the last 2 seasons, he's been disappointing. His stock has dropped quite a bit. I remember when he initially came into the draft, I didn't think he was worth a second-round pick. We ended up drafting a different second baseman that year with Elijah Warren. While I don't think Simpson is worth a second-rounder, I also felt like he should have gone a lot earlier than the 6th round this year. And even though his development has been a little bit slower than hoped, I still think there's some talent there. Intriguing bat, good enough defense, pretty fast. I think for the 6th round, getting somebody who was once seen as a second-round prospect, the upside is still there, and it's worth a swing. So ultimately, Tom Simpson will be our final pick of the draft. I'm curious to see how we're going to have to afford all these players because rather than paying 6 guys, we need to sign 7, thanks to the compensatory pick. We were able to make it work last year with Tommy Rogers, even though he asked for obviously a very large bonus, being one of the top projected picks in his draft. But nonetheless, I'm really excited with how this draft turned out. We wanted to pick guys who would give us an impact early on. Johnny Hackman is somebody who I think can pretty easily win a starting job out of spring training next year, and I think there's an outside chance that Luis Velasquez skips minor league baseball as well, given how good he is against left-handed pitching. Francesco Gutierrez is a fascinating player. If he hits his ceiling, I think he could be really good. Chip Gilmore as well, very high upside. Our scouts thought he was one of the 10 best prospects in the draft. And then our late picks, all intriguing in different ways, with Quinn Monk in the 4th round, Omar Jimenez in the 5th round, and former 2nd rounder Tom Simpson in the 6th. I'm pretty excited about our draft class. I don't think it's going to be quite as stacked as last year's. I think part of that was because last year's class was probably the greatest draft class I've ever seen in this game. So I don't think we're going to end up with as much luck as we had a season ago, but still a lot of guys who I really like and think can make impacts for us pretty soon, especially some of our top picks. That brings us into where we go into for the next episode as we make it through the All-Star break. Aaron Savale has one more start. We're hoping he does well enough to get the starting spot in the National League, with Kyle Harrison and Logan Webb possibly making the All-Star game as well. We're also going to make it up to the trade deadline. We have 4 series before then, and we're playing against all really good teams. Most notably, we played the Dodgers twice. We have built up a really nice lead over the last couple of weeks against the Dodgers, but if we don't perform well over these 2 series, that could change. We also have Toronto and Texas, who are both over 500, both very strong teams in the American League. We're only playing teams that are above 500 until the deadline. Again, most importantly, 6 games against the Dodgers. If we perform well, we'll be in the driver's seat to win the NL West. If we lose, then the division race is wide open once again. So I hope everybody enjoyed the episode. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Let me know what you thought of our draft down below in the comments. Peace out.